Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 15 of the Dance Physio Podcast. Thank you so much for being here today. We are going to be talking all about the adolescent growth spurt and how this relates to our dancers. So I think a lot of people have kind of heard this terminology before. Everybody sort of recognizes and realizes that there is sort of this period of growth that happens right around adolescence. Sometimes we just refer to it as puberty, or it gets called a variety of different things. But we're going to dive in today and really look at what is the adolescent growth spurt. What do we mean when we're talking about it in terms of like the actual definition of it? What are the physical effects of it? What's actually happening in the body during that time? And then how it relates to our dancers and how we can help our dancers who might be going through this time of kind of a growth spurt that's happening. So we're going to dive right in, and I'm going to start just by giving you the definition or sort of like the description of what the adolescent growth spurt is. So the adolescent growth spurt is the rapid and intense increase in the rate of growth in height and in weight that happens at a specific time. So it's a little bit wordy in terms of like the actual definition, but the really important sort of piece to pull out of that is that when we're talking about adolescent growth spurt, we're really talking about the rate of growth that is happening. And so this definition uses the words rapid and intense, but really we're talking about the rate that it's happening at. So another sort of definition or another way that we describe the adolescent growth spurt is the period of peak growth velocity. So again, we're talking about the speed with which growth is happening. So we aren't always talking about the most amount of growth that's happening in sort of a dancer or in a human. It's the speed or the rate with which it happens. So there's a lot of growth that happens like sort of over a relatively short amount of time. So we see this happen in basically all areas of the body, and we'll get into kind of how that happens a little bit more when we talk about the physical effects of it. But this, like I said, is the period of time with the most rapid amount of growth throughout like all of this dancer's or this human's development. So we think about babies and toddlers and stuff like really growing and changing super quickly or like changing a lot. And they do change a lot, and they maybe have more relative total growth that happens. But when we actually look at the rate of growth and sort of like how fast it's happening or the velocity with which it's happening, this adolescent growth spurt is actually where we see the most rapid changes in growth. So this generally occurs in specific time frames. It's a little bit different for male and female dancers, and I will say that there is massive amounts of individual variability within this. So in females, kind of when we look at the literature, it's said that the adolescent growth spurt will happen anywhere between 10 and 14 years old, and then in males, generally it happens about 2 years later, so we see sort of between 12 and 16 years old. I will say from experience, we often see that happening like maybe most commonly between like 11 and a half and sort of 13. Obviously, huge variability. So we're going to have some dancers who start their adolescent growth spurt a lot younger, and we do see lots as young as 10. And then we have other dancers who might not start that adolescent growth spurt until a little bit older, like closer to 14-ish. But on average, I would say 11, 12 is often when dancers or female dancers are starting to enter this period of rapid growth. And then again, our male dancers are generally going to be about 2 years later. On average, this period of rapid growth or this kind of growth spurt lasts for about 18 months. Again, huge variability, and in some dancers or in some people, it can last for up to 3 years. So depending on how rapidly these changes are happening, that might influence the length of time that this lasts for. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with, some dancers or some kids that just like you don't see them over the course of the summer. So you see them at the end of the dance year in like June, and then you see them again in September, and it feels like they grew an entire foot in like 2 months in the summer. And then other dancers where it seems to happen a little bit more slowly and steadily. So that's going to account for some of that variability for why some dancers are going to, be maybe closer to that 18-month range for their adolescent growth spurt, and some are going to be more towards that 3-year range. Regardless of where dancers fall within that age spread of like how long their adolescent growth spurt is happening for, it's a fairly significant length of time. So this isn't something that like happens over the course of like a month or two. This is a process that is happening over the course of a year or potentially 2 or 3 years. And so that's a really important thing to remember, because when we are working with these dancers and when we are teaching these dancers about their bodies and about what's happening, it's really important that they know that this is like a bit of a process that's happening. This isn't something that changes overnight. This isn't something that like happens within a month or two and then is like done and they're sort of, finished growing or whatever it is. So I think it is important that we really understand how long this process can take. And also, again, that variability in terms of some dancers starting it quite young and other dancers maybe not until a little bit older. And this can make it really difficult as a teacher, because you can have a group of dancers who, all dance together, have potentially danced together since they were quite young. And if you have one dancer who starts to go through their adolescent growth spurt, say maybe around 10, they might be finished by 11 and a half or 12. And you could have another dancer who hasn't even started their adolescent growth spurt until maybe more like 13 or 14. And they may be somebody who it occurs for a longer period of time. So if it's 2 years or 3 years, they might not be finished that period of intense growth until they're more like 15, 16. So you can see how there's a huge amount of variability and age spread that this occurs. And we're going to talk about some of the implications of this in a minute, and you'll see how this can make it a little bit challenging as a teacher or as a choreographer when you're working with some of these dancers. So what exactly do we see in the body when it comes to the adolescent growth spurt? Like, what is actually changing? Obviously, we see an increase in height and an increase in weight that happens, but what are those effects on the body? So the biggest effect that we see, and where we see the most rapid growth occur first, is in the long bones of the body. And so we see increased length in those long bones. So that would be like your femur, your tibia, your humerus, so like arm and leg bones, basically. All of the long bones in the body is where we see the most rapid increase in length. We see those increases first relative to changes in torso kind of length when we see this growth. And I think as teachers especially, you're probably like well familiar with this, where you'll have dancers who will sometimes jokingly sort of refer to them a little bit as like Bambi, because all of a sudden their arms and legs are just like much longer than they were previously, but their torso hasn't necessarily caught up yet. And so they just like all of a sudden look like kind of like a Bambi learning how to like walk again, or you just notice that their limbs are just relatively that much longer. So that's sort of the primary thing that we see this increase in length of the long bones. With that, we also get an increase in length that happens within the muscles and the soft tissues. This, however, is slower to occur. So we see the length increase in the long bones first. This is sort of the first thing that happens with the growth spurt. And it takes longer for these changes in length to happen within the muscles and other soft tissues. And so what we actually get is a relative sort of tightening of muscles, if you will. It's maybe not the best description of it, but if you imagine that, our muscles are kind of like our elastic bands, and if you were trying to attach an elastic band around one end of something and then it was attached around the other end of just two fixed objects, and then you moved those attachment points further away, so that would be the bone lengthening itself, you can see how there's more relative stretch on that muscle or elastic band in this analogy. And so we get this like temporary decrease in flexibility and also a temporary decrease in relative strength in those muscles. Because if those muscles are being put sort of on stretch because the bones are longer than they were previously, we are changing what's called the length tension relationship in that muscle. And muscles rely on this length-tension relationship in order to be able to generate strength or generate power within those muscles. So we will relatively see a decrease in flexibility and strength happening as the long bones are getting longer. This resolves over time as those soft tissues catch up in the growth in terms of their ability to lengthen, but they're slower when it happens. And so we see the bones grow first, and then it takes a little bit longer for those soft tissues to kind of catch up with that. In terms of other physical effects that we see, again, because we see these changes in the length of the long bones relative to torso length, we actually get a change in the center of gravity. So center of gravity is kind of the area of the body where our mass is centered over our base of support. And really, in terms of dance terms, or if we're thinking about this like relative to dance, it's kind of a dancer's ability to like be on top of their leg or find their center or any of that terminology that you're going to use. I think most dancers are intuitively aware of this concept, especially as it relates to turns. You know, like we'll talk about being on top of our leg or things like that. And that's kind of our ability to control our center of gravity. And as dancers are going through this adolescent growth spurt, their center of gravity changes. So they have to learn to adapt to these changes and to figure out where their new center of gravity is. And this is challenging, not only because they have to like adapt and figure out where the new center of gravity is, but it's also constantly changing. So if this process is occurring over 18 months or 2 years or however long this adolescent growth spurt is happening for, they're constantly having to make these adjustments to where their new center of gravity is. And as a result, we see a decrease in balance and proprioception that happens during this adolescent growth spurt. And proprioception is our ability to know where our body is in space. So again, similar concept of just kind of like knowing where you are, knowing how to like balance on top of your leg, get on top of your leg, being able to turn and do all of those types of things. So with adolescent growth spurt, we see this decrease in balance and proprioception occurring. We also see a decrease in what we call motor control, and that is like our ability to control our movements within our bodies and sort of the coordinated fashion with which those movements occur. And so again, this kind of relates back to that sort of like Bambi dancer where all of a sudden you'll kind of look at those dancers and think like they just look a little bit less coordinated than they usually would. And teachers oftentimes will kind of note this as they'll be like, their movements just look less sharp or less clean, or they look a bit sloppy or things like that. And it's not that the dancers aren't necessarily trying hard or working as hard as they did previously. It is often that they just are in this period of like decreased motor control. And so they actually physically can't coordinate and control those movements as well as they maybe previously have been able to before this period of growth. A couple other physical effects that are worth noting. We're going to talk a little bit about bones. So because we have this like period of most rapid growth, and the growth, like I said, occurs primarily within the long bones of the body, or that's where it starts from, we get a temporary weakening of the growth plates within those long bones. So because of these rapid changes that are happening, we're sort of relatively weakening the growth plates. And we also get transient low bone mass during this time. And again, it's because of that rapid growth that happens. The bone all of a sudden gets like a lot longer than it was previously, but relative to the length of the bone mass actually decreases. And this is really important to take into consideration because dancers who are going through their adolescent growth spurt are going to be more susceptible to potentially growth plate injuries or bone stress injuries happening because those bones are relatively weakened while this growth spurt is going on. So there's a lot of different physical effects, and that's not an exhaustive list necessarily, but those are like key ones that we see really commonly. And it's quite a big list of things that are happening within the body. And all of these together leave the dancer potentially susceptible to an increased risk of injury during this phase or during this time. And I kind of often joke in the clinic that the vast majority of my clientele are like 12 to 14 years old, and parents will come in with their dancers, and, it'll be a dancer I've never seen, and they've danced since they were little, and all of a sudden around 12, they'll have like injuries that start to crop up, and, sometimes it's like knee pain that starts first, and then there's like hip pain, and then back pain, and then foot pain, and, it can be one thing after another, and parents are always like, what's going on? Like, why are they always injured? Why do they have all this pain? They never had any issues previously, but it's because they're going through this period of rapid growth, and there's all these physical changes that are happening in their body that are leaving them more susceptible to these injuries. And so I sort of joke with the parents that like, I'm going to see them lots between the ages of 12 and 14, but once they hit that age, I like never see them again. And it's, I'm saying it a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's honestly not that incorrect. The vast majority of our clientele are often dancers who are right in that kind of adolescent growth spurt age. And not to say I never see those dancers again, but oftentimes by the time those dancers hit 15, 16, 17, I'll see them very occasionally, or I see them much more for preventative type things. They're not coming in with injuries continuously or things like that. We are seeing them, maybe they have like an acute injury, like they've rolled their ankle or something, but it's not these kind of just like, I have knee pain that kind of started out of the blue. Those types of more what we would maybe classify more as like a chronic injury or an overuse injury. So we certainly clinically see a big increase in the amount of issues that dancers have right around this adolescent growth spurt. And I think it is not surprising, or it should not be surprising, given all of these changes that are happening within their body during that time. And like I said, this list is not exhaustive, but these are sort of the major ones that we see. So what are the implications for dance with this? So we have these dancers who all of a sudden their center of gravity has changed. They're less flexible. They're less strong. They have less motor control. They're more susceptible to bone injuries or growth plate injuries, stress fractures, things like that. And usually right around that same time, so maybe by the time they hit 11, 12, 13, we are also often really increasing the demands that we are placing on those dancers' body. So right around that same age is often when dancers start to like move up in level. And so they'll go from, a more junior program, or maybe even like a recreational dance program, or maybe they're competitive, but it's not like super intense or super serious. And they start to level up. And so they get into these programs that are a lot more intense in terms of the number of hours that they're training per week, and often technically a lot more difficult. And there seems to be a really big jump. And if you are a studio that follows any of the kind of like graded or like syllabus type, examination type syllabus, there's a big jump in technical skill that happens right around when dancers transition into more of those vocational levels. And we get to like the intermediate foundation and intermediate, and that often corresponds to dancers being kind of 12, 13, 14 years old as they're moving into these more vocational levels. So we see the demands that we're placing on dancers increase really exponentially at a time when their bodies are already a lot more vulnerable to what is happening from a physical standpoint. And so this is something that I think the dance industry really needs to take a look at, and in an ideal world, kind of address this and really look at, okay, is this the appropriate time to be really increasing the physical demands on these dancers? Or is this actually a time where we need to be pulling back from the physical demands? So when we look at, okay, what can we do to address this? What can you do as a teacher, as a studio owner, as a choreographer? Well, I think the first thing is that we need to be able to identify and recognize when we have dancers who are going through this adolescent growth spurt. So if we have a dancer and maybe you've worked with them since they were young and they're working really hard and they're improving and you're like, okay, this is the year we're going to like really step it up. But then also they start to go through that adolescent growth spurt around the same time. maybe we pull back a little bit that year. Maybe that isn't the year that you give them the solo that's like the hardest technical solo that they've ever done, or they're doing 6 solos this year. Maybe it's a year that we say, okay, do you know what? We're only going to do 1 or maybe 2 solos, and we're also going to maybe pick something that's less physically demanding. So rather than really trying to up their technical level, maybe we're going to really work on something that's like a lot more artistic this year and really kind of rein in the technical or physical requirements of it and focus on another area of developing that dancer. So maybe it's their artistry, maybe it's their storytelling ability on stage, things like that, so that we can give their body a chance to catch up. Now, I'm certainly not saying that dancers like shouldn't be dancing during this time, because absolutely they can be. But do we also want to be like pushing them to their absolute extreme physical limits? Probably not, because that's when we start to run into issues and see these increases in injury and these increases in dancers kind of coming into the physio clinic trying to heal and rehab these injuries. So in terms of things that we can do from like a dance culture or dance community perspective, I think we really want to go back to basics when we have dancers who we know are going through this like adolescent growth spurt. And I know this is a super hard sell for dancers at that age. Like this is the age where they're like really keen and they really want to learn all the really hard stuff and try all the cool tricks and all of that. But this is probably a time where we actually want to really rein them in and go back to basics. Every dancer can always benefit from going back to basics. And so this is a time where if we can really educate the dancers and say, do you know what, like we're going to focus on some really fundamental technique things so that you can reestablish some of those basic technique fundamentals in your new body. So learning with this new center of gravity and with these longer legs and these longer feet and whatever else it is that they're dealing with, that's going to really serve them super well. So going back to basics can be really helpful. We want to, like I said, potentially focus on artistry. Find something else about that dancer's dancing that becomes a goal for them to work on over a period of 6 months or a year or 18 months or whatever it is. So when we're looking at, okay, is this dancer making progress? Maybe we want to have non-physical goals for them to focus on. So rather than trying to get their triple pirouette or trying to get, an aerial or these like really physically challenging feats, maybe we want to really work on, okay, what are your goals in terms of your artistry, your storytelling, your port de bras, whatever it happens to be. So having goals that are maybe not as physically related during this time. We really want to focus on strength and motor control during this time. So this is a time where dancers really benefit from additional supplementary training and also cross training. So if you have dancers who have not ever been participating in any sort of supplementary training or cross training, this is absolutely the time to introduce it to them. I mean, ideally, maybe they've been introduced to it even younger, but if they haven't, this time of adolescent growth spurt is really such a great time for them to learn some fundamental kind of movement skills. So if we're thinking about more traditional cross training or strength training, like weight training, learning how to do a proper squat and a proper hip hinge and things like that can really help to reestablish some basic like physical literacy skills and basic movement patterns that aren't dance related per se. So that will help them again learn how to like live in their new body and figure out that new balance and proprioception and like center of gravity and all of that kind of stuff. We may want to consider limiting how much impact dancers are going if we remember that dancers, their growth plates are going to be more susceptible to injury and their bones are potentially have this like transient decreased bone mass or lower bone mass. We probably want to really think about how much we're managing the impact load that those dancers are doing. And so this is a little bit challenging because we often don't measure impact load in dancers. And so we don't necessarily have a good baseline for how much impact dancers are doing to begin with, but it's just something to consider. And so if we are adding in additional cross training or things like that, potentially adding in like a running program that's more impact loading at this time might not be the most appropriate. Maybe we want to be adding in lower impact. So maybe we're doing stationary cycling if we're looking at increasing their cardiovascular fitness or things like that. So that's not to say dancers should never be running or anything like that, but during this time of adolescent growth spurt, maybe we need to be considering trying to manage their impact load a little bit in through there. And that can also apply to like the studio in terms of like how much jumping we're getting them to do. And again, if you're working with a dancer with like solos, maybe this is not the year that you do the solo that's like the most high energy, most explosive jumps, most amount of like tumbling and tricks and things that are really high impact. Maybe this is a year that you do a solo that, you know, is a little bit more adage based, maybe has more floor work, maybe is just a little bit lower impact because, you know, it's not just performing that dance once. If that's a solo that a dancer is working on for the season, they're repeating those same moves over and over and over and over and over again. So cumulatively changing up choreography during a year where they're having rapid growth can actually make a really big difference in terms of managing that impact load in their bodies while they're going through these changes. So again, it's hard to measure, but it's just something to take into consideration when you're thinking about, okay, what's the plan for this dancer for this coming year? Maybe throwing in lots of extra tricks and tumbling and stuff is not the best idea for this particular dancer. And then kind of the last thing of what can we do is, like I said, I really think that educating the dancers on this is so important and being able to relay this information to them, because a lot of dancers come into the clinic really frustrated with what's happening with their body. And a lot of them are frustrated from a like flexibility perspective. They'll be like, I've always been able to like get my splits or get my legs high in a kick or things like that. And now they're like really struggling with their flexibility. And so they're, you know, just like stretching and stretching and stretching and stretching, but they're not necessarily addressing any of the other components of what's happening in their body. So these potential, you know, decreases in strength happening or muscle imbalances that are happening or the, you know, change in their center of gravity and things like that. And so really helping the dancers to understand what is happening in their bodies is so powerful so that they actually can start to work with their bodies rather than like kind of fighting against them. And I find that the dancers, once they understand that this is like a physiological process that's happening and there are things that we can do in terms of going back and making sure that we have like adequate strength and working on basic motor control patterns and really looking at technique fundamentals, they're often really willing to put in that work to do that because they feel like there's a solution to what's going on rather than just fighting against their body and expecting that they're going to be able to continue to dance, you know, the same way they did before at the same level they were dancing at before when all of a sudden they have what is essentially a completely new body. So I think really educating our dancers and hopefully empowering them to understand what is happening so that they can work with their body instead of against their body. And that's also going to give you more buy-in if you are going to, you know, change up what a dancer's focusing on for like a year or two, where you're like, do you know what, we're not going to push you to the next level, or we're going to really rein things in and focus on more artistic stuff right now, or that type of thing. They're going to be much more on board with that if they understand physically what the reasoning behind that. It's not just like, oh, well, I don't think that you're ready for it or you're not talented enough or, you know, like any other host of reasons that they're going to come up with within their own head if we don't give them those sort of concrete reasons. So really, yeah, education, I think, plays a massive, massive role. And then also as a teacher or studio owner or whatever role you play in a dancer's life, a clinician, really just being patient with your dancers. So there's so much change that is happening within their bodies. And so you as a teacher need to respect that and be able to accept it, because you may have a dancer who, you know, was a fabulous turner before and had no issue, like, you know, with like triple pirouettes, quadruple pirouettes, whatever. And all of a sudden their turning, you know, just seems like it's off and they just can't, you know, find their balance or things like that. And there's probably a very good reason for that. And there's a good chance that they're going through a bit of an adolescent growth spurt. So being patient and understanding that all of these effects are transient. So everything that we've just talked about in terms of the decreased strength and motor control and changes in balance and all of that, these are temporary. This isn't like this dancer's new normal, but these are changes that they have to just be patient and work through, and they'll get back to where they were. And in fact, they'll get back to better levels if they take the time to really focus on these fundamentals and work on building, movement patterns and motor control and all of that type of stuff. But it is a process and it does take time. And so we need to be patient and recognize that this adolescent growth spurt can last for up to 3 years potentially. And so we may have some years with some dancers where we need to adjust our expectations and really adjust kind of the demands that we're placing on that dancer and on their body during that time frame. So I realize that as a teacher, this is challenging because, like we talked about before, these changes are so individual. And so when you have a group of dancers and some of these dancers are experiencing these earlier and some are experiencing them later, it really does make it challenging. But again, I think as long as the dancers understand what is happening, and as teachers that you understand what is happening, it just gives us a little bit more context and potentially a little bit more grace in terms of allowing their body the time it needs to adjust and relearn and for that dancer to learn how to live within their new body. So I am going to wrap things up there. I hope that you have found that informative and helpful, and I hope that it's given, especially teachers, a bit of food for thought in terms of how or what we are expecting from dancers when they are going through these times of rapid growth and rapid change. As a dance industry, I really think that it would be amazing to have some bigger conversations happening around sort of the levels that we see and where we really see the technical challenges increasing exponentially. And it would really serve dancers to have some of that stuff happening later. So, there are some competitions I know that have tried to address this a little bit in terms of not allowing dancers below a certain age to be competing in point shoes or to be doing certain tricks on stage and things like that. But I think it's a much bigger conversation that we could be having in terms of looking at how do we develop syllabus and things like that, and potentially holding off some of these really big leaps in terms of technical training or even just in terms of expectations of hours of training and intensity of training till after dancers have kind of gone through that adolescent growth spurt. But like I said, that's a much bigger conversation. It's something that as an industry, I don't know that we'll see huge changes on really rapidly or immediately, but as individual dancers and individual teachers, we can really start to tailor this to dancers on an individual basis and hopefully help those dancers go through this adolescent growth spurt with minimal injuries and a much, much better understanding of what is actually happening within their body. So I'm going to wrap it up there. If you have questions, thoughts, anything about this episode or any other questions about adolescent growth spurt, please feel free to reach out. You can find me on social media at Dance Physio Erika with a K, or send me an email. My email is in the show notes of the podcast episode. And thank you so, so much for listening. I know that your time is valuable and you could be doing anything else right now. And so I really appreciate it and hope you have a fabulous rest of your day.